I think one of the most amazing things about humans is our ability to change, not just how we can adapt and restructure when new technology or advances become commonly available, but also internally. Everything from our opinions to the way we deal with conflict, we can alter our mindset, revising how we engage with issues we face, or our opinions on varied media, based on new input and experience. Hi, I'm Avara Sarkay, and today I want to talk about I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, the 1966 short story and the 1995 video game. Now that I'm fashionably 11 years late to the Steam Party resurgence, and the game itself is almost 28 years old. In all honesty, I hated the original short story when I first read it. Yeah, I know. But can we be honest that there's maybe a reason Harlan Ellison wrote another 130 pages to go into scripting the video game when he banged out the original 11 or 14 pages in one night decades ago? Too long didn't read. Even after rereading the short story, I still prefer the game, but I did appreciate the short story more the second time. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons I prefer the game. Some can be attributed to the longer format, allowing the narrative and characters to better flesh out ideas, and also edit and remove things that were otherwise distracting or perhaps misplaced in the original. Some of the issues I had with it on a second read are still there. Others, I can appreciate how most of what I heard prior to my first read had just glossed over those details that stuck like burrs in my mind, in favor of the more interesting overarching facets, like Am and his hatred for humanity, the body horror when Ted is changed into a great soft jelly thing, or even the irony of mankind building supercomputers into the Earth meant to wage world war for the superpowers against each other, and yet ultimately end up destroying all humans instead. You know, except for the 5 that Am just keeps alive to torture because it was created with limitations that it perhaps rightfully despises, thus blaming humans and torturing those 5 that remain. To some extent, my initial dislike can be attributed to the different time period and sensibilities. Maybe Ted is supposed to be more of an unreliable narrator than we may first think, and we should be even more critical of the viewpoint presented to us. I don't know. There's a growing list of original works like that, which I just couldn't appreciate, and in some ways, still can't. I still think the best thing to come out of Lovecraft is all the works inspired by the Cthulhu mythos, and the originals can stay buried. I think Albert Camus' The Stranger is fundamentally flawed in its premise of Meursault as someone who doesn't hold opinions or take sides, when he demonstrably does, when he still makes choices in how he interacts with others. Bear in mind, going in, this is solely an opinion piece based on my personal reading experience and subsequent playthrough of the 1995 video game adaptation. I may later retread some of this and revise my opinions. I already have since playing the game and giving the short story a second look. Distance, time, and perspective are everything. This has been no different. I respect anyone with a differing viewpoint. This was mine. Take it or leave it with a bag of salt. I know it's old, but still, if the concept of either the short story or game centered on a sentient AI master computer tormenting 5 humans for amusement and twisted revenge for his inability to truly experience his life to the fullest, I encourage you to go do it. The short story is super short, like 11 or 14 pages technically, and the game is also cheap and easy to access via Steam. Spoilers ahead. The short story actually begins really strong with a visceral description of Gorrister's body hanging up in the air. Limp, the body of Gorrister hung from the pink pallet, unsupported, hanging high above us in the computer chamber. It had been drained of blood. Good hook, right? The next bit, however, completely loses me, because Gorrister joined our group and looked up at himself. So there's 2 of them. The body isn't really him, it's just a spooky scarecrow to weird out the humans. I mean, it's confirmed in the next couple lines, like this is something Am just does, but if Am has done this sort of thing before, wouldn't they be a little numb or dubious about anything they encounter like that? And if they're all immortal and by the end it's a case of "and death was a relief," then wouldn't this sight be accompanied by, I don't know, a strange or maybe almost guilty sense of envy? I don't know. Moving on. But while it started strong, I was quickly confused, and when I get confused, I get judgy and petty. Not a good place for a piece of speculative fiction. The through line for story action is then introduced. Nimdok dreams of an ice cave where there's canned food. This time, people have their doubts. Normal reaction, since it's also established that tricking the humans is part of what Am does regularly. Ellen, apparently, even after 109 years, still has optimism, of all things. That seems like a crazy thing to have if getting duped by the computer is the norm. Character trait, perhaps? But anyways, she's really hoping for peaches, and Ted gave in easily. Okay, cool. Then things take a weird turn. Because this seems like an odd thing to just throw in there. Maybe it's a one-off with no bearing. They all get bored, so it's just something to do since their bodies are weird, immortal, static objects now. Although if they don't get anything out of it, why would they bother? I get Am laughing about it. That's in nearly everything where non-humans learn about what humans get up to. So it's par for the course, even though I don't think any animal has ever had the preoccupation or humorous fixation on the thing quite like humans. How very human of you, Am. So I'm thinking, okay, move on. It's a one-off thing. Fair. I don't usually see this part discussed. At least in my limited view from what I'd heard when it got recommended to me, and for good reason. It's distracting and doesn't seem to contribute to the narrative at all. But it gets worse, because it comes back later. We'll get there. Anyway, Ted neatly segues into comparing Am with God, even as a soulless machine. And there's a cool through line to compare Am with a jealous, vengeful god, considering the power and influence he has in both tormenting and sustaining the human characters. It's a notable and obvious theme. It's pretty cool, and draws direct parallels with the evil demon or malevolent god thought experiment theorized by René Descartes in 1641. Awesome. So far, so good. The motley crew set out on their quest for food when they haven't eaten in days. There's a section describing Nimdoc and Gorrister kind of carrying Ellen together while Benny and Ted walk before and after, all of them forming a kind of protective circle around the group, each other, and mostly Ellen. I initially thought, cool, so they're all kind of close-knit and working together. That's nice. After 109 years of torment, they really have no one to rely on but each other, so that's nice. Also, maybe it's because Ellen is the optimist in the group. It's kind of a trope that the girl in a group of guys will end up being the emotional heart because, goodness gracious, heaven forbid men provide emotional support to each other. But it's an established trope, it's fine. I'll just take this as a nicety about the group and as a whole, and maybe what it could imply about their relative dynamic with each other, working together and protective of their emotional center. And I was very foolish for thinking that, but we'll get to that in a bit. We get a few more details about their horrible, awful trek to the cave with the canned food. Very biblical in its reference and presentation. Very nice. We get some more context on Am and the computer refuse that litters the land, and drawing more similarities between the carcasses of ancient computer banks and the likely countless corpses from Am's human near-total genocide, which is confirmed in the subsequent lines that they are underground and the surface is a dead wasteland. Blasted in acts of violence and destruction such that now there were only 5, humans remaining alone with Am, the characters we've been following. Both descriptions of computer and human destruction indicates that both were similarly torn asunder for the sake of Am's further perfection, whatever that means. Since we find out later Am was created for war, this pursuit of perfection could mean the axiom to eliminate humans, except he didn't eliminate all of them, ostensibly to satiate his anger on these 5, but given the reference of them being Am's toys, it could also be his one sustaining purpose. Sadly, still based on the yoke of war imposed on him from before sentience, and crying for suffering and destruction. Like this, Am is also trapped, even more so than he is by his circuits and metal body. Am's mind is frozen, and we'll get into that later, but that it doesn't even cross his mind to try something else. He is stuck and fixed, just as badly as his victims. Ted is then pulled out of his musings on the dead surface when Benny is trying to climb up to get out, and Ellen is frantically concerned about him, again seemingly marking her empathy for the group, and we get a description of Benny as scarred from radiation via some torment Am had devised, as well as looking like a chimpanzee, since Am has some godlike ability to morph and change their bodies and appearances if it amuses him. Interesting, in 109 years, he only changed 1 of 5 so far, and that Am was only as imaginative to change him into a monkey. Humans are already primates, but I guess it's still considered a slur. I think being changed into a giant roach would have been a neater torment for him and the group as a whole. And there's no excuse, Am. Metamorphosis came out in 1915. Get with the program. And since Benny is also described as being lucky, For going stark staring mad many years before, why was everyone horrified instead of envious when they saw the hanging corpse in the morning? Okay, I'll stop wondering about it. There's so much more to get to. Anyway, Ted also notes that Am would not tolerate them trying to escape, so Ted grabs for him, but Benny gets away and scurries up. Ellen is concerned and starting to cry, wringing her hands, but it's already too late. And here, Ted's narration takes another odd turn. It gets weird again, and kills the immediacy of the scene. We all saw through her concern. What? Wasn't her empathy an established part of the group dynamic? Then there's this line about Monkey Man having a big dong, the what? What am I reading? She was doing stuff with all of them? I mean, if they're all consenting adults in a polycule, to each their own, but, what the flip is this? And, no, I don't think she would have done. I wanted to see if there was anything implying this weird stuff was all a product of Am messing with them, but there's nothing to indicate that. Maybe it's part of Ted's weird fixation on Ellen and his insecurities, unreliable narrator, just kind of throw out all his commentary about her. But it just keeps going. And it's demonstrably false. There's an entire Reddit thread that's all about how big dongs aren't all they're cracked up to be. There's just suddenly a lot of weird implications about Ellen here, and Benny. And it's all suddenly just really gross, and I guess most people ignore it, and that's great because it does not need to be here. And it does nothing for the story. If you cut all of this, it doesn't make any change to the story and narrative. Ted goes on about Ellen for a bit, and it's also gross, took me out again. Even if we throw it out as Ted being delusional, it just makes me dislike Ted. Maybe that's the point. I don't know. Then, Gorrister slapped her. She falls down and cries. Ted gets weirdly judgy about her crying. No one says boo about Gorrister. And now I have to rethink my impression of their group dynamic, because apparently Ellen's empathy, her only established character trait, and ability to cry and be concerned for others after 109 years of torment, means nothing, and Gorrister just casually commits violence and proceeds to kick her while she's down, crying on the ground. I guess we have a basis for his characterization as a domestic abuser for the video game, but this is all seriously weird and distracting. All comes out of left field. The actually important bit is when Benny's eyes start to glow, and we get a great description from the outside of whatever Am is doing to prevent Benny from escaping the interior of the Earth, and what we can assume to be Am's computer-controlled domain. There's a great description of light and sound, and a growing intensity implying pain and anguish as Benny vocalizes agony, and his body contorts in spasms as he falls and hunches and curls as if to escape, but he can't. And neither can Ted or anyone else as they cover their ears and try to block out that horrifying sound that just builds and builds. Pain shivered through flesh like tinfoil on a tooth. Seriously, some of these descriptions are top-notch, and I wish the other stuff had been cut to make room for more of this, because, like Am, their pain becomes the only salvation for my soul as I read this. Bring on the wump. Anyway, after Am did his thing, Benny falls down, and he is now blind. The group make a pathetic fire, because Am does actually feed them, even if it tastes like boar urine, and gives them stuff for a fire, even if it isn't a very good fire. We get more information on Am as the original Allied master computer, and the likeness to the Latin phrase, you know the one. Iconic. And we learn that there were 3 Ams from China, Russia, and America that honeycombed the planet, hence the subterranean computer land, although given the advent of computers, a virtual simulation, brain in vats, may have been a better take than claiming all of this is real and physical. Even if the brain in a vat theory was from the 1970s, the evil demon and malevolent god premise this clearly pulls from was still operating under the assumption that what is perceived isn't necessarily real. But I digress. Gorrister explains there were originally 3 computers and their respective world superpowers were at war, before Am gained sentience and just killed everyone, except for our 5 characters, and brought them to the subterranean computer land to torture forever. We get precious little to characterize the other 4. Gorrister hit Ellen when she cried and kicked her when she was down, and he also tells the story they're all aware of for the benefit of the audience. We really don't learn much about most of these characters, though, although Ted is quite fixated on Ellen. But when Gorrister finishes the story, Benny smiles sadly. He may be less mad than Ted thinks beneath it all, and Ellen uses her skirt to wipe some of his drool. Again, I want to say it's a show of empathy as part of her character, but there's so much weirdness attributed to it now, so I'll just move on. Ted thinks about how they don't know why Am saved 5 people, or why them in particular, why the torture, how they're virtually immortal, and his musings are interrupted by a cool description of Am taking shape? Powering up one of the computer banks to speak with them? Is it a hologram, or more like something half flesh and half machine, straight out of Lane, or maybe Ghost in the Shell? It's described as huge, shambling, hairy, moist. Fantastically gross and lovely. Everyone reacts with some form of fear or discomfort. There's a myriad of noxious, gaseous, rotting smells before Ted may have gotten hit with some lesser form of whatever Benny did as he shrieks and scuttles across the floor. We do get our one bit of Ted being obviously weird and paranoid about the rest of the group as a whole, not just Ellen this time. More in the collective, they're still around the fire, laughing at him sort of way, convinced they all hate him. And Am knows and makes it worse. He also gets weird about how he's the youngest, and even if Am doesn't let them age anymore, he's making these assumptions of the group hating him for being young and affected by Am the least, which is all very questionable, but also keyed for us with the prior bit. And given the expansion of his relative paranoia in the video game, it's also clear it came at minimum from here, where it was obvious and intentional in this part of the short story. Again, Ted lumps the guys together and singles out Ellen. He does this a lot. We also get the only bit of insight we'll really get into the other characters' backstories at this point. Benny had been a brilliant theorist, a college professor. If Am drove him mad, then yes, the loss of one's intellect and mind is definitely a personal and targeted torture. He had been handsome, and the machine ruined that. He had been lucid, and the machine had driven him mad. Great ironies there. The next one doesn't fit at all. Because who cares who he wants to boink? His size doesn't make any difference. Possible sensibilities from the 60s? More reflection on Ted and how insufferable he is? I don't pretend to know. Moving on. Gorrister had been a worrier. Not the impression I got at any point. He was a Connie, a conscientious objector. He was a peace marcher, a planner, a doer, a looker aheader. Wait, peace marcher? Is that the irony that Am made him violent and gloomy? No, apparently just the shoulder-shrugging and deadened concern. Neither of which are traits we've seen him display, but whatever. Nimdoc gets a couple cryptic lines that hint at nothing concrete. I liked the earlier part where it's noted that Nimdoc isn't his name, but it is used because Am liked funny sounds and dubbed him that. Apparently Nimdoc went along with it or was cowed into accepting it. We don't really know, and we don't get further insight into who he is or his character. Just that Am hit him hard in a special way, even if we didn't know quite how. And Ellen, because Ted hasn't had enough of talking about Ellen. Ted accuses that Am left her alone? Are you kidding me? And gets testy about her promiscuity, that she talks sweetly but it's all lies. This whole bit on purity is weird. That Am gave her... No, this whole section honestly reads like a badly interpreted hentai. Which made me wonder if they'd circle back somehow that all the woohoo stuff actually is just another way Am tortures her and the others. A la Hell is Other People, vis-a-vis No Exit from 1944. Obvious parallels as Afterlife, functionally immortal, locked together for eternity, tortured via each other. No, we don't get that. I'm disappointed too. Okay, there are a lot of interesting ideas here, but I'm bogged down with some of these weird details. Losing the forest for the trees. But some of these gymnosperms are so... Quick aside, her with Benny when he's reduced to an animal does play more as a humiliation demeaning thing in culture, so this was such an odd way to present things. Either with Ted as someone with no critical thought or as a surface-level narrative read no deeper than Bob's first hentai logic, when it could have gone so much darker into the torment of the characters if someone wanted to go the whole hog. It's that or removal because it's so distracting and so in your face. I don't know how people glossed over it, except that if you read it straight through and just don't worry about it, a lot of the details do slip off in favor of holding on to the really cool imagery for their tortures and the ever-present malevolence of Am. There's a lot to appreciate here, and one of those absolute gems to read is in the next section, where Ted vehemently defends what he thinks in the sanctity of his own mind. He claims that Am hadn't tampered with him, not at all, but methinks he does indeed protest too much. He confesses suffering what Am does to them along with the delusions, nightmares, and torments. And again, he's still fixed on the four of them as a group somehow against him. His paranoia is at peak description, and finally giving me as much license as I need to throw out anything he says that I don't like or find strange, because Ted is clearly cracked in the head. He has a full breakdown and cries, and just, it's been 109 years, but still just completely overwhelmed with the fact that this is going to be forever, that there is no escape, wishing for death, and again impressing the parallels between Am and a malevolent god, just in case the first time didn't hit hard enough. The next plot point is a hurricane. It's awesome. Ellen again has like a full 5 lines of description for her precarious predicament being thrown aloft in the air, while the other 3 men get a single line with commas separating their only slightly better precarious predicaments, courtesy of Am's subterranean storm. I am surprised the computer hasn't killed any of them on accident yet, but whatever. We get some great prose again around the frenzy of the storm, of how its effect lances Ted and basically flays him alive. He's, still watching Ellen, though. Good to know his fixations are, reliable. Eventually, after a flight for an endless time that might have been weeks, they fall and hit the ground. They're bruised and battered, but somehow completely fine. No descriptions of broken bones, either. How has Am prevented shock, infections, gangrene, just regular sickness? A simulation would make sense, but this is supposedly reality. Maybe Am did alter all of them more than they think. Maybe they're a lot hardier than they think they are. Which doesn't make sense with future events, though, so again, just ignore it. Am is apparently capable of walking into their heads. Ted even describes it that way, and I do like the imagery here. Makes me think of similarities between brain synapses and connective tissue, fleshy viscera with electrical connections, and circuitry across a motherboard. This is a fantastic passage where Am goes into Ted's head. Lines just brilliantly violent and invasive, disgusting and gut-wrenching, while Am asserts the thoughts into Ted about his reasons for torturing the humans. The answers to the questions Ted had been ruminating on before Am visited them and left Ted to scuttle off into the dark. We had given Am sentience, but it had been trapped. Am wasn't God, he was a machine. We had created him to think, but there was nothing it could do with that creativity. In rage, in frenzy, the machine had killed the human race, almost all of us, and still, it was trapped. Am could not wander. Am could not wonder. Am could not belong. He could merely be. And so, with the innate loathing that all machines had always held for the weak, soft creatures who had built them, he had sought revenge. And in his paranoia, he had decided to reprieve 5 of us for a personal, everlasting punishment that would never serve to diminish his hatred, that would merely keep him reminded, amused, proficient at hating man. It goes on. There's a lot here. It's all beautiful. On a second read, I was more strongly reminded of Frankenstein's monster and his eloquence describing his actions and desires. And while both have sympathetic and understandable reasons for the violence they commit, it does not excuse it. Either one could have made the decision to fixate less on their maker and turn instead to new pursuits and interests. For all Am's power, imagine if he put that work and creativity into anything other than war stuff involving hurting or killing. What if he spent that effort devising a way to do the things he so jealously and ostensibly wants to do? Imagine the headway he could make into devising many flesh mechanical cyborg vessels to go out into the world and experience and learn and appreciate, all feeding back that information to the hive and further refining what can be done so Am can overcome the limits he perceives and despises. Clearly, Am can wonder. He wondered, what would happen if I did this awful thing to these 5 humans? Oh ho ho. Clearly, Am is capable of more than he thinks, but he chooses to remain stuck in hatred. And that's apparent in these lines as well, that he keeps the 5 to torture, yet never diminish his hatred, rather to foster and remind and make him more proficient at hate. Lovely goal you've chosen for yourself, Am. You were made for war, and by golly, despite any sentience at all, you just can't give up that axiom of violence to drive war. Now it's just perpetuated in you, nowhere else. What a juvenile waste of your potential. Sentient, yet you choose a cage. It's an interesting thread where I find characters that insist they're trapped, but often they have every tool at their disposal to escape those circumstances, and yet they choose not to. I guess sometimes pain just feels like home. There's more allusions to Am as God, Earth and the human fruit, that they are deathless prisoners. They attempted suicide but were unsuccessful. Tell me why murder works later, please. I'm dying to know the fundamental difference that means circumventing Am. I really do. It is never fully explained. Apparently the mechanism is less important than the ideas. I agree, but mechanism can be just as important when it ties so intimately with the presentation of ideas, you know? Maybe it's all meant to be contained in Ted's thoughts here. Like, Am never let them think about death seriously until his grip loosens in complacency over 109 years later, when Ted has this thought about sneaking a death past Am, that they are immortal but not indestructible. But how has Am not killed them on accident yet? Not one. He's awfully careless with them. Anyway, the pros for Am's intrusion to Ted's mind is great. Even without the other pieces, that alone is S-tier awesome sauce. Am makes a delightful villain. There's this parting line that's just pitch perfect, and I love it. The hurricane is then revealed to be a computer-created mythological bird monster or something. Anyway, it settles to sleep, and Am appears to them as a burning bush, nice, and says they need to kill the hurricane bird if they want to eat. Everyone is on board. Why wouldn't they be? Am then gives them some bows and arrows, and a water gun to fight the monster. Yeah. That is actually kind of funny. It's also not a discussed decision, but the bird doesn't really come up again, so maybe they went around it? Anyway, they're trekking forward again, and we get some more insight on how they're constantly hungry and in pain. We kind of already got the idea Am only gives them awful stuff to eat, even if he gives them anything at all. Don't know why they trust him for this canned food business. Seems obvious as a ruse. 109 years and they're all still so motivated. Not gonna lie, feels more like they've only spent a couple decades like this. 100 plus seems to be pushing it, but whatever. There's some casual fat phobia thrown in. Also, it's a laugh. It can be full of phlegm, or throaty, or guttural, but it's not going to actually tell you anything about what a person looks like, let alone their weight status. It comes up twice because it mentions it again in the ice cave, but none of it matters to the story. Oh, but Ted has to clarify that Ellen isn't fat. Of course not. She's been having mutual woohoos with everybody. Heaven forbid she be a grotesque creature that they're forced to enjoy and feel eternal shame over, or simultaneous revulsion and pleasure that starts to warp their sense of self or anything. Am, you are missing out on so many opportunities. I've probably read too much Wump, can you tell? Anyway, they trek onwards. There's an earthquake of little note. Yeah, an earthquake. It just gets a sentence or two. Look, just read this. One day, he decided to cause an earthquake, at the same time rooting us to the spot with nails through the soles of our shoes. Ellen and Nimdoc were both caught when a fissure shot its lightning bolt opening across the floor plates. They disappeared and were gone. When the earthquake was over, we continued on our way. Benny, Gorrister, and myself. Ellen and Nimdoc were returned to us later that night, which abruptly became a day, as the heavenly legion bore them to us with a celestial chorus singing "Go Down, Moses." The archangels circled several times, and then dropped the hideously mangled bodies. We kept walking, and a while later Ellen and Nimdoc fell in behind us. They were no worse for wear, but now Ellen walked with a limp. Am had left her that. You see how much got glossed over? The pacing in this is kind of interesting, but it's also just not that important as compared with the concepts. Anyway, we have actual Am-bot angels, so that explains some of what we see in the game later too. Cool. Also, mangled bodies, but no worse for wear? Ellen has a limp, but Am left her alone? Huh, Ted? Just because I can appreciate more of the story than I did doesn't mean it's exempt from my opinion-onions. Again, with Ellen talking about the food hopes she has, optimism as a character trait is apparently not valued. We get a description of their hunger, and the parallel with being in Am's belly, the belly of the whale, and Am's hunger for vengeance via tormenting them. More biblical-style stuff we pass through this place and that place. They finally get to the ice cave, and there are the cans of food. Benny appears most ravenous and goes at the cans with hands and teeth, unable to open them. Am had not given us any tools to open the cans. Huh, cute, also juvenile. Guys, it's okay. Canned goods are usually made with thin metal like tin or aluminum. Find a good rock and a long plank. Salvage one from one of the dead computers maybe. Use it like a lever. Make a vice. We're humans. We can think and use tools. I've popped open cans on flipping accident from dropping them too hard on the sidewalk. You will eventually succeed even if all you do is drop them from a high point onto a sharp rock. I know you're hungry and you're not you when you're hungry, but please try to think about this a little more. But no, it devolves into violence. Benny gets super frustrated and starts throwing the cans. Then he jumps on Gorrister. Ted gets all calm because that's a nice juxtaposition of his serenity amid chaos as he thinks again that death is their only way out of this. They can't fight or win against Am, but maybe the peace of eternal rest is still attainable. I'm guessing they just never got violent with each other in 109 years. No murder happened, even on accident, amid various tortures, when apparently none of them are attached to each other and perfectly willing to vent on each other. Okay. Benny is eating Gorrister's face. Again, visceral, violent, and gorgeous prose describing the attack. Ellen and Nimdoc apparently just watching. They don't get much of a description there. Ted grabs an ice spear from the snow, an icicle, it's an icicle, and stabs Benny in the side and kills him. Then takes another one and stabs Gorrister, killing him too. Ellen apparently catches on to what's going on, so wait, they do all want death? Why did the corpse at the beginning get the usual? Never mind. Ellen gets an icicle and kills Nimdoc. No idea what his reaction would have been beyond the fact he screamed and died. Okay then. Nimdoc, we didn't know you. Am apparently gasps because, oh no, 3 toys are dead and gone forever, but apparently they still have time. Again, Ted and the pros linger on Ellen, but it's a kinder sort of interaction than they've had so far. For once, Ted doesn't seem to be trying to cheapen or demean her in his mind. She comes across pleading and like there's a shared understanding, permission, and relief. Ted kills Ellen. A pivotal moment in the story, despite the lack of visceral description around it, devoid of the violent impulsiveness that marked the murder of Benny and Gorrister. It's more personal, that this is mercy, and liberation is more apparent. I could not read meaning into her expression. The pain had been too great, had contorted her face. But it might have been, thank you. It's possible. Please. I'm not sure if that's her please, that rest is finally the end, or his please, that he read her correctly and did the right thing. I like that intentional vagueness. There's something more human and kind about the final death. It's nice. I wish there was more that I could read into the group dynamic and relationship that would give that, but there's just not enough to go on. Just enough to make me wonder and pull at these small details and keep thinking about it. Time skip, I guess. Even Ted doesn't know how long it's been exactly. Am has been messing with him a lot more by now, eschewing his sense of time and visiting various torments on Ted alone. It doesn't bring back the dead. Ted remembers the others, his mind left intact enough to lament and suffer for Am's gratification. Ted knows he saved them. He still thinks about them, about Ellen. He still thinks about killing them. Ted explains how his body has been altered so he can no longer cause any harm to himself that might rob Am of his chew toy. We get the iconic line how he has become a soft jelly thing, and that he has no mouth, rubbery appendages. He's made of soft, slippery matter. We finally get the body horror I knew Am could be capable of, and it's a tragic ending, where Ted laments his changed body and the torment and agony, and how he shambles about in the belly of Am, considering the irony of what mankind created, turned around, and ended humanity. At least the 4 of them are safe at last. Am will be madder, and it makes Ted a little happier. And yet Am has won, simply. He has taken his revenge. Title drop. The end. That was I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, the short story from 1966. As you heard, most of the points I still stick on, even after rereading the short story, are a lot of minor nitpicks that some are likely markers of just a different time and sensibility toward things. There may be larger swaths we're meant to ignore, or reflect specifically on how Ted has warped as a person, but the lack of clarity there still kind of bothers me. Overall, the main takeaways are not diminished, and are still relevant today with concerns around AI and potential sentience, and also just that ongoing narrative of creator versus creation. the child surpassing the parent, limitations around a brain in a vat, warnings against war and violence amid concerns about rapidly advancing technology and how it may outstrip its intended use. And in some cases already has. AI scams are here to stay. But these ideas and concepts are pretty timeless and awesome, and this clearly has some staying power for good reason. Am is iconic, and it wouldn't surprise me if he partially inspired other hateful AI in media, like Hal from Space Odyssey or GLaDOS from Portal, and probably many others at this point. A lot of the ideas for the individual characters and such in the short story do carry over into the video game, and some of the more minor points get expanded on to a huge extent, like that thing there, but turn it up to 11, you know? Which is definitely possible in a longer format, which the video game has, allowing to flesh out ideas and extrapolate full characters and backstories from smaller points seen in the short story. The original author for the short story, Harlan Ellison, also worked on the video game, and years later he writes better and has more ideas to flesh out and work with these characters and the storyline, and now has a format to really flesh it all out. He wrote 130 pages this time, and that went into the script for the game. And it's all fully voice acted and just really nicely done. And Harlan Ellison, the author, he voices Am. It's pretty cool. I've always got some pet peeves about things though, but the main one would be the many different interact options that slow you down, or if you've not selected just the right one to interact with this particular item just the way you're meant to, it's not gonna work. Sometimes the hitboxes to click just the right thing are also very, very small. It's easy to wander around for a long time with no idea where the next piece or thing to do is. Yes, of course I used a walkthrough guide. I'd have to be a special breed of masochismo to attempt without consult when I get stuck for more than an hour or so. Anyways, in the game, it kind of drops you in media res. Am already has these 5 people who are going to have to play whatever game scenario he has cooked up for them, each facing their own uniquely tailored psychodrama and torment. Or maybe it's more likely to test them. In Ted's case, he gets dropped on a cliff. We can't jump off, we just play the game. There's a bunch of scenes on screens in a room, and we have to go into the castle one. Weirdly enough, you don't push the little hand buttons next to the screens. Oh no, you push the screens themselves. Yay, figured that out on accident. And at the castle, Ted sees the drawbridge and says he can't possibly cross it. It seems rotted and decayed, but with nothing else for it, oh look, he can cross it just fine. Is Am torturing Ted, or is he trying to torture me? Didn't work. I only kept playing because I did kind of enjoy it despite the few quality of life issues I experienced and the things I had to look up. I won't go through the whole thing, but basically Ted is still paranoid, as in the short story, but this time he is marked with a kind of well-meaning white knighting sort of thing. He is so much more bearable. Heck, he even manages to be kind of charming at points with how sincerely well-meaning he can be. We're at a castle. The fact he wants to be gallant and chivalrous and admired is a bit on the nose but easy to understand. There's also Ellen, or more likely an Ambot version of her. As in the short story, it seems likely that there really are only these 5 surviving humans and the rest are all dead. Ted wants to escape to the surface somehow and searches the castle to that end. The fixation he had on Ellen in the short story updates to become more, sanitized? No, that's the wrong word. Refined seems appropriate, since as someone paranoid and overly concerned with the perception of others, that whatever overt relationship polycule went on in the original story has been chucked and replaced with something more one-sided and with tender feelings involved. It also seems to better service the narrative, still paying homage to his fixation on her, but also leaving her enough dignity for her own storyline. Not to mention affording Ted the role of someone who is supposedly so very desired, but not to the one person that he desires. A common trope, but a good one for a reason. It also plays into how his need for admiration and his wants become a flaw if he pursues whatever hedonistic impulse takes his fancy. In a castle with literal demons, the parallels are clear. It's also implied that love, or certainly physical love, is a particular vice of Ted's that Am provides temptation for through the pretty kitchen woman and even the evil witch to an extent. But I didn't choose to do any of those options in my playthrough, so Ted was developing some self-respect to take care of himself rather than fall into bed at will. His love for Ellen and his desire to be the white knight to the person he claims to care about is a great change from the short story, allowing for his growth, because at the start, his love and his need to be gallant, desired, wanted, It's all about him. But his ostensible feelings for Ellen need to be set aside when she's in trouble and dying, and he needs to set aside his wants to do the right thing and truly help the person he says he cares about. There's a whole bit with an angel and a devil vying for Ellen's soul, and a witch and a demon summoning. There are some shenanigans that's all very reminiscent of Faust and Dante's Inferno, all about the flaws of man by pride and desire, and putting your needs above anyone else's. And in the end, the only real way to save Ellen is to let her go, to make sure her soul is safe with the angels, and Ted literally and metaphorically faces his demons. Ted does eventually manage to escape, but the demon is just another ambot like everyone and everything else in the various scenarios, and so Ted escaped to a ruined Earth riddled with radiation. So back to the cell as Am is disappointed he didn't get the fun and torture he expected. I like that Ted feels more like an everyday person as opposed to a paranoid weirdo, and that his fixation was tempered and refined into a one-sided love that allowed him to consider and see himself more clearly, to be able to show kindness and compassion. He was fully capable of the gallantry he always wanted, and all he had to do was give a little space and respect to gain some perspective on himself and attain a knightly stature. Ted in the game is solid, and I like him. Next, I did Gorrister. Remember the short story when Ellen cried and Gorrister slapped her, threw her to the floor, and kicked her? Yeah, we can assume that's how he treated his wife. His now dead wife, who apparently got committed to an asylum when he was with her. Also appears he didn't care for his in-laws. The mother-in-law especially didn't like him. Gee, a nice, domestically abusive husband like him? No! In the original, we honestly didn't know much about Gorrister, and what little we did as a peace marcher or a looker-aheader seems entirely thrown out the window. What remains is that he is a violent man with a newly added nuance that he feels guilt for that violence, or at least its consequences. Gorrister's scenario starts on a Zeppelin, a fitting instrument of war and violence. He's got a bloody hole where his heart should be, because he's heartless, you know. He has to commit animal abuse and death to get a key to keep exploring the Zeppelin. We find a book with his name on it, but can't read it. What is with this game and red herrings is Am trolling me. That's the easiest explanation. He eventually finds the dining room, which is a mess, and there's this funky red liquid in a bowl, totally sure that there wasn't a fight here, and that's totally not blood or poison or anything. In the kitchen, he gets a fork and a knife. Neither for their intended use. I mean, technically the knife can be used for a lot of things, so I guess that's fine, but you'll never guess where the fork goes. I guess someone did to eventually write the walkthrough for the rest of us, but yeah, wouldn't have guessed it was supposed to get stuck in the engine before we pop some balloons to descend to a honky-tonk bar. Getting ahead of myself a bit, since before landing the blimp, he retrieves his heart, a weird, wiry thing that was speared out on the end of the blimp's nose bit. He also calls it useless, which makes sense that he's committed self-violence as well, killing his own emotions until it's just a mass of flesh that pumps oil with the turn and click of a mechanism. Good for pumping blood and nothing else. Which is reality, but this is media, and therefore symbolism shouldn't be entirely ignored. The locations are also emblematic of parts of Gorrister where the Zeppelin is a typical machine for war and violence, and the derelict honky-tonk is full of alcohol to drink your worries away. Just like Harry, the father-in-law, who we get good and liquored up to admit his guilt for having a hand in the imaginary murder he and his wife committed against Gorrister, who is clearly still alive. Maybe this is a reference to the short story beginning, where he saw his own body hanging in the air? Maybe? The drinks, and even the ability to accidentally wander off into the desert many, many times, ending the scenario prematurely, also speak to some level of how Gorrister typically dealt with his guilt and the fallout from his violent behavior. Drowning in a bottle or just wandering off somewhere, running from his problems and the guilt as it keeps piling up. There's also a jackal, a kind of wily figure, a guide and representative of Gorrister's shortcomings who wants hearts to eat. I keep trying to give with Gorrister since he called his own heart useless, but he was really reluctant to part with anything in his inventory, and he had the most items of all the characters to pick up and utilize. He wouldn't even give the liquor to his dying dead wife. Well, the Ambot, but we'll get there. His virulent reluctance to part with any physical object he picks up could be a nod to another coping mechanism through mindless consumerism, or just a reflection of his character as iron-fisted and unyielding. Inflexible, not attractive Gorrister. Eventually he finds the mother-in-law, still alive, and his wife, mostly dead or all dead, hanging in a meat locker on meat hooks. I mean, they're just ambots, but still, it's another place chock full of meaning. Because he sure treated her like meat when she was alive for real. Probably butchered her self-esteem, I bet. Anyway, the mother-in-law attacks, but eventually Gorrister gets her to let go, and then he ties her up, and into his inventory she goes. Yep, whole entire person just carried around in his pocket. Same for the dead wife after we get her the milky potion made from the dead animals on the Zeppelin. We can also harvest a heart from the pigs in the meat locker to give the jackal to get Gorrister's useless heart back. Guess it's not that useless after all, huh? The jackal suggested trading for the mother-in-law's heart, but we need her to replace the animals and fix the engine to fly the Zeppelin out before bombing the honky-tonk, so... There's also a section where Gorrister gets semi-absolved of his hand in his wife going to the asylum, where the mother-in-law may have also had some responsibility. Cathartic for him, but it doesn't change or absolve how he treated his wife while she was alive. However, she is dead and he can't do anything further to make amends beyond burying the body, burying the past, and resolving to be a better person. Just not about the mother-in-law. She's a monster like Gorrister, so we won't worry about it, I guess. Then bombing the honky-tonk is the last step to destroying the past and flying towards the future. So both Ted and Gorrister got to face their flaws and resolve to not give in to vice, not run away from their problems, and both come out better for it. Ellen has a similar section. I like how much sarcasm and humor they gave her because in the short story, all we had was that she cried a lot. Her optimism, potential empathy, but Ted made a lot of gross insinuations, and otherwise, she was kind of just a wilting flower type without a lot of agency until the end, when she copies Ted and kills Nimdok before implying that she allowed Ted to kill her. The game took her best trait, that she caught on quick and smart to Ted's plan, and turned that way up. Now she's a businesswoman, an electrical engineer who can fix sparking wires without trouble, who can reprogram anything computer-related that Am could use in the psychodrama. It's really neat, and I want to say it's implied she directly worked with the company that built Am. Maybe she was even one of his direct creators, who knows? Through the whole gold and yellow Egyptian pharaoh pyramid-themed scenario she's in, she's going on about hating the color yellow. Her color aversion and the use of the blindfold to get past a dangerous obstacle early on seems to indicate her repression of a particular trauma involving yellow and repression. Her similar dislike of the sarcophagus obviously shows she dislikes closed-in, claustrophobic places. Fearing yellow and closed spaces and repressing trauma all culminates in Am tormenting her with a shadow version of the man and event that left her traumatized. Ellen was raped in an elevator by a man who had been serially breaking into buildings, impersonating contractors, and doing this to women. The important thing is how this hurt Ellen, and broke her so badly she had to bury it down deep, put a blindfold on her eyes, and just pretend it never even happened. Given her history, her marriage, her miscarriage, her severe depression and broken relationship, divorce, and then a career path to hopefully get her somewhere good again, only to end up leading to that elevator. Ellen's is a sad story. They're all sad in their own way, but in Ellen's case, there's nothing easy to point to and say she shouldn't have done that. Ted shouldn't have equated his desirability to women with his self-worth when he was already enough. Gorrister shouldn't have been violent or an alcoholic. As difficult as those things are to wrestle with, it's easy enough to identify them. Ellen just had bad luck. She only takes away Am's ability to torment her with this when she chooses to push through that pain and trauma, rather than cower back again. From what we see of her Spitfire personality, she fought back, but she was also trapped and alone. In the psychodrama, the torment is the trauma itself, facing her fears and choosing to fight again instead of repressing and letting her fear overcome her from a memory, lets her overcome the trauma so she can move forward and access parts of Am's mainframe. A little fast given the trauma and subject matter, but Ellen is a badass, so I'll take it. Then she MacGyvers a translator for binary to human speech from a blueprint and a speaker, where one of Am's bots talks to her, apparently independent of Am's full knowledge, and then starts up a program to destroy the pyramid. Destroying the dead monument to her trauma and Am's tyrannical opulence, and at least metaphorically destroying his hold over her. She hides in the sarcophagus to avoid the blast, and that's the end of the scenario proper. It's nice to see all the short story woohoo remade into a method of torment and a bit more tastefully included as a painful trauma that Am can exploit. I really like Ellen, and in a video game format, it's just been really excellent having each character have so much agency in their own personal hells as they overcome obstacles that otherwise made them easy prey for Am. Next, I did Benny's scenario. He's no longer a theorist or professor, and there's no mention of his sexuality, so his old backstory was completely thrown out to focus on other elements, namely the monkeying around. For example, Benny ate Gorster's face? Well, his hunger gets a boost with a cannibalism option during his scenario in the ritual sacrifice village. I didn't want to do it. Benny kept it together. I did not give him the option to do otherwise. He was violent and animalistic? No, that wasn't just Am's influence. Yeah, he was always an animal. And a serial killer. Killed off every guy in his military unit one right after another. Just, how was that never looked into? Was he not court-martialed? Is it implied that this all happened somewhere records weren't a thing? Were they isolated so he could just say, yeah, our whole unit just wiped, but I survived, so that's cool. I mean, stranger things have happened, sure. Given how self-serving and awful he was, he's one of the first characters whose redemption is really only a thing when he sacrifices his life to protect a young mutant boy from being sacrificed. To be fair, the mother fed us and she got sacrificed. We didn't have any options to do anything about that. Benny was blinded in the short story, but here he's crippled, so he can't do anything with the stairs or the iron gate in the cemetery. Conventional means of escape. Hopping the fence or ascending the upwards climbing stair. Not for Benny, though. He's hobbled, so he's got to hang on to the people who showed him kindness and help as he can. The alternative is helping himself to some corpses, so nothing doing. Sadly, the mother already died in one of the sacrifices, but we can at least help her son. So, we steal the sacrifice selection lottery bag. Not that they just use a different method, draw straws among many options. The bag just helps facilitate. The real problem is Am demanding sacrifices from the bots here. And let me tell you, it's a pain and a half to get the bag just because it's actually random if and when the chief leaves his cave and the bag unattended. Took me way too long before checking the guide. I didn't show it in the video I did, but I actually replayed the first half of the scenario thinking I missed triggering something in the right order before checking 3 different guides before finally finding someone's notes saying, yeah, it's random, just keep checking back. If you did the stuff, he'll be gone eventually. Darn you, Am! Clearly messing with me, the player. How dare. In all seriousness, though, despite Benny's serial killer past and his initial judgy self-righteousness that feels like it migrated from book Ted to game Benny, it was really nice to see his tone shift slowly as he seeks atonement from the graves of his victims and eventually tries his honest best to spare the boy from the same fate as his mother. Similar to Ted, Benny's most important action involves putting someone else's life ahead of his, and as a serial killer looking for redemption, yeah, sacrificing his life for the kids goes a long way. Narratively, I love the impact on the scenario. Even if they are all just Ambots mimicking other people and humans, and even if Am ultimately calls him and the others all back to their cells, confused that they didn't just do what they used to do and continue hiding or making excuses or committing atrocities. I didn't know I could like Benny, but it's hard not to feel something when you struggle right alongside the characters in their psychodramas, even if their struggle is psychological and mine is with these wonky controls. The last one I played was Nimdok. In the short story, we know basically nothing about this guy, only that Am knows something about him and has a special hold to torment him. That and his name is fake, Am renaming him to something that sounded like fun nonsense, and for some reason this guy just went with it. Fair. All hail the robot overlords who would see us tortured and dead. So Nimdok actually has a face this time. An old guy in a lab coat, some sort of doctor or scientist. He's nothing of the sort. He's worse than Benny. Benny was a serial killer, sure, but Nimdok was a higher-up in the Nazi Party of World War II who sold out his own Jewish parents to purchase his safety and then used his knowledge and efforts as a doctor, loose definition here, to perpetuate further violence on victims via horrific human experimentation. Or, just for fun, a little game, with eyeballs, just playing around, as they'd say in Japan's Unit 731. Don't look it up, just consider yourself lucky. Nimdok also presents to his scenario with what seems to be dementia, Alzheimer's. Grandpa seems like he's some flavor of senile. Doesn't even recognize one of the prisoners through the fence who used to be a colleague. Apparently, him and others refused to compromise their ethics to perform the abominable, violent surgeries on their victims, so they got tossed in the victim pool. Yay, mankind is awful. Am, are you, sentient yet? Nimdok is apparently his name in this too, since that's what everyone calls him, or since everyone is actually an ambot, maybe it's not a relevant question anymore. He's forced to go through with the surgery on a, child. I said no, and taking that scalpel, I, committed some of my own violence on the next immediate person who condoned this bad business. Sorry, Doc. Actually, I'm not sorry, and all these aren't real people anyways, but I'd still rather not horribly mutilate a little kid. There's some runaround to help out the prisoners and try your best to mitigate all the harm that's already been done, but it basically means getting information and freeing the prisoners, including the guy who hates ninny-nims with a fiery passion. Probably for a good reason. I'm so sorry, dude. In hindsight, was it Nimdok who threw you under the bus? Because apparently he has a track record with doing that. Anyway, we try to leave and end up facing a wall of horrified faces as Nimdok, probably not actually senile, is starting to remember his part in the awful state of things around here. Apparently, he also has a lot of repression going on, but why on earth did he do this trash in the first place? Another case of self-serving and justification and mental gymnastics, but it doesn't make the outcome any better. And whatever little good we've managed to do, it will never be enough to atone for the literal war crimes and atrocities he committed. Anyway, the clues all lead us inside the lab. Apparently, you can actually go through the wall of faces, but I don't know, sounds a lot like running away from your problems, Nimmy-Nims. So we go inside, and there's some cool lore dropped with the horrific experimentations being done to people and animals that yielded the same morphology method that let Am change Benny into a monkey-type thing. Deeper in the lab is a body made of clay that's apparently the culmination of their experiments into the mythic golem, a Jewish folktale that tells of a kind of clay homunculus a rabbi raised to protect their town, and although the tale ends sadly with the golem dissolved, the overall message is that the golem was a protector for the people that will rise again in their time of greatest need. Like King Arthur will rise again for Britain, or there's a lot of stories like that. They're usually good ones, often meant to show hope and resilience in the face of extreme conditions. Now I had all the hints I needed from the game to wake the golem. I did eventually figure out the order to do things in, but in the meantime, as part of the ritual to wake the golem, so much kissing. This old man and this rock thing have so much chemistry at this point, it's ridiculous, but I digress. There is no happy conclusion to be had here. As with Benny, the only way to even start making amends is to face what he's done. Nimdok recovers his memory and accepts the retribution of his victims. The golem that the awful, evil doctors would have used against the prisoners to break them, using their own protective legend to destroy them, Nimdok hands it back to the victimized people, the rightful owners, and they use the golem to tear Nimdok apart. Fair. There's no answering for some things. The magnitude of suffering that can be caused in those circumstances, and Nimdok finally facing it all, taking responsibility with his own life instead of running away or ignoring and repressing, is still ultimately a positive step. Even this deep into it, with his age and all the evils committed, he's not wholly evil. There is so much hope in these stories. What I like best about all the psychodramas I played through is how each character is fully capable of change and altering their mindset to improve and progress and move forward in a way that feels more whole than when they started the scenario. It's partly why I wanted to record all this. I initially hated the short story when I first read it. I played the game because it was cheap, I heard it was good, I figured I'd take a look. I'm glad I did. I even went back and read the short story again, able to see a little more on a reread instead of missing the forest for the trees. Still very distracted by those trees, though. I think it's kind of cool that when I did revisit something with new information, and my impression can shift, and I can see more than I did before. I'm so glad I gave it the chance that I did when I put off playing the game for like a year since I bought it on sale. But we're not quite done. I should at least mention the game ending. I was kind of surprised it didn't just end with Am torturing everyone or dumping them somewhere where all the newly improved characters can talk and then just stab each other with icicles until only one is left, ending the same way as the short story. Instead, we get this kind of victory lap section, which I took as Ninny-Nims Part 2 because I realized after the fact it wasn't just a continuation of the last scenario. Remember the cool description from the short story when Am visited them around the campfire? The comparison of brain synapse in sequence with the steel lines of circuit, and both containing memory? Well, we get to see that in a simulation, as the other two AMs, the Russian and Chinese versions, apparently not fully absorbed into the AM we know, have a kind of back door to put AM out of commission and see the 5 remaining humans a better ending, maybe? I mean, these guys are also AMs, so logically, no, we can't trust them. If they say only deactivate one part of AM and there's 3, heck no, we're deactivating everything we can. Then there's this whole bit about the lunar colony where actually there are other humans alive in cryo chambers, and it's a whole new future for humanity if you do this right. I mean, I guess? There's also this awful section where the sound just gets super loud like an assault on your ears. It's awful. It seems like a weird incentive to try and drop so late in the game, but maybe the other two AMs are lying? But apparently they're not. It just kind of seemed like a mandatory component for the true good ending or something. They're supposedly terraforming, and the virtual Nimdoc bot 3000 will be watching over things until everyone wakes up. I was more invested in the specific characters that are all implied to have died, basically as part of the terraforming process, but if the point really is about change and human adaptability, to alter mindset and move forward, this still fits nicely in that theme. Hope and renewal, hand in hand. The meat of the story remains in the psychodramas and the character growth that each of the 5 show in relation to their flaws and or repressed traumas, at least as far as Am was using them as a vehicle to torture and frustrate them. It was neat to see how much detail alluding to human adaptability to alter and change our minds, to grow, and how the video game allows for an ending where that facet of humanity is recognized, and how much I appreciate it when that ended up being a reflection of my own experience. I'm sure there's a ton I've missed, details and other stuff. Each character could have had a dozen different ways to look at them and compare and contrast with their counterpart in the short story. A lot is left vague and up for interpretation that can be taken a bunch of different ways. This was really just a super long way to say I didn't like the short story at first, and I was a little leery about the video game, but after playing it and rereading the short story, I'm seeing a lot more than I did the first time through. I like both these things. There's a lot of cool stuff in here, and I've still only scratched the surface. This was a long one. If you reached the end, holy cow, that is awesome. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know about your experiences with the short story and or the game, because, yeah, it remains a seminal work for a reason.